My paper is also an expression of the fact that I'm a pacifist myself who wants a world without war. I became a pacifist in part through experiencing war when I grew up in Africa, but then also my research since then. My definition of pacifism is without violence, against violence, which is the same definition that Stellan Windhagen uses to define nonviolence. And I use the two terms interchangeably, and I think that this helps us get rid of that, I think, false dichotomy between principled and pragmatic nonviolence. My simple argument is that within the field of international relations, and that's basically where my paper is directed at, and I recognize that when I give this paper to international relations audiences, they're shocked and horrified, and some of them shout at me. But for you guys, this will be nothing new. You'll all agree with me, I'm sure. But pacifism, I've been doing a research project on this from a critical discourse analysis perspective. Pacifism fits the definition of what Michel Foucault calls a subjugated knowledge. And he defines subjugated knowledges as, he has two types of subjugated knowledge. One, and I quote, those blocks of historical knowledges that were present in the functional and systematic ensembles, but which were masked, and the critique was able to reveal their existence by using, obviously enough, the tools of scholarship. So they're blocks of knowledge that are suppressed within broader historical ensembles. Second, those knowledges that have been disqualified as non-conceptual knowledges, as insufficiently elaborated knowledges, naive knowledges, hierarchically inferior knowledges, knowledges that are below the required level of erudition. In other words, forms of knowledge that are viewed socially as being conceptually inferior. Now, pacifist and nonviolence theory features both types of these subjugated knowledges. It exists within the functional and systematic ensemble of international relations, but only on the margins and in a kind of subterranean level. And at the same time, it's considered and dismissed as unscientific, non-conceptual, naive, inferior, and so on. And the evidence for this, I mean, can be assembled easily from public discourse. I don't know if you recall the criticism of Jeremy Corbyn late last year, who refused to endorse the renewal of the nuclear Trident submarine system in Britain, and also refused to support the bombing of Syria, and he was publicly lambasted for being a pacifist. And that term was used as an insult, and it was said that if he's a pacifist, he can't possibly hold public office. No serious person could be a pacifist. You know, you only have to look at movies and so on. There's never been a superhero who's a pacifist. The project that I have done has looked at 10 years of the top 10 IR journals to find any articles that mentioned any terms connected to pacifism, and found 7 out of like 7,000, which supports Dustin Howe's general observation, who similarly looked more broadly at political science and says there have only been a handful of articles devoted to discussing pacifism in all the major generalist political science journals combined in the US over the last 40 years. I also looked at conference programs, textbooks on politics and international relations, and then I interviewed 40 or so scholars. And basically, the subjugation of pacifism as a discourse relies on two main mechanisms. One is silencing. It's simply not mentioned, it's simply not discussed, it's not used by scholars, including scholars who conduct what we call normative IR theory, which is looking at the use of force in international politics and the ethics of it. And then the other one is shaming. A great many scholars that I interviewed all mentioned instances where they talked about pacifism or used pacifist theory and then were publicly shamed for being pacifists. And there's a whole series of common narratives and analogies that are used to construct pacifism as a kind of inferior outsider theory within the discipline of IR. For example, it's argued that pacifism is a single absolute moral position, which, because it rejects any and all force and violence, rules it out as a resource for thinking about the challenges of violence in politics. Pacifism involves passivity because it entails doing nothing in the face of violent attack. Or pacifism is inconsistent because if an attacker threatened your family, you would engage in self-defense, but then you refuse to extend the same principle to the state. It's argued that pacifism is immoral because it's unwilling to protect endangered others in order to preserve personal principle. It's naive and unrealistic about the perfectibility of human nature and the nature of evil, and therefore can't contribute to discussions about how to deal with violence and threats in the real world. Pacifism, while an admirable personal quality, is not appropriate to politics and public life, and no leader could be a pacifist. It's ineffective, especially in the face of overwhelming force wielded by an unprincipled foe. Here, we often find the Hitler and Nazi analogy, which is always brought up, which proves that nonviolence is hopelessly naive and unrealistic. And then pacifism is dangerous because it signals weakness and thereby encourages aggression. These are all popular tropes and narratives that are used when pacifism is mentioned to try and denigrate it. Now, the consequences of this are that obviously subjugating pacifism works to maintain the core identity and boundaries of international relations and politics as a discipline concerned with war, military force, states, and security. But it also functions to maintain and reify dominant power knowledge structures, or what Foucault calls the existing truth regime that exists in society, and which is preserved and fused together with interlocking institutions of state power, including the military, security services, universities, schools, media, and so on. It functions to help the military-industrial entertainment complex continue. But most importantly, for the paper that I've written, it restricts the ethical imagination in relation to dealing with ongoing threats and crises. I mean, in many ways, the belief that pacifism and nonviolence has nothing to offer policymakers is at the root of the Groundhog Day we're in, whereby every terrorist attack we face is reflexively responded to by an increase in the use of force. We can't think of anything else. And that's because we've subjugated pacifism out of the picture. So this paper is called Desubjugating Pacifism, and my argument here is that, and this is not the only way to desubjugate pacifism, but one way is through techniques of critique and deconstruction, which involves undermining the accepted beliefs, norms, and ideas about pacifism and violence, the kind of common sense which is the base which makes the practices of militarism and war seem normal. So we've got to deconstruct those, and we do that I think in three different ways. The first way, obviously, is to respond to and in turn deconstruct those narratives about pacifism. So, for example, it's pretty easy to demonstrate that pacifism is not a single moral absolute position, but encompasses a range of different types of pacifisms, just as there are different types of feminisms and environmentalisms and anarchisms and so on. You know, there's nuclear pacifism, pragmatic pacifism, epistemological pacifism, collectivist pacifism, and so on. It's also very easy to reject the argument that pacifism is passive. Pacifists, and I quote, do not claim that it is wrong to resist violence. On the contrary, they claim that violence should be resisted. They just believe that there are strong moral grounds for preferring to do so non-violently. Following Gandhi, pacifists argue that pacifism does not mean meek submission, it means pitting one's whole soul against the will of the tyrant. It's very easy to deconstruct the individual attacker analogy. There are also quite a few good arguments that we can bring against the Hitler analogy. And then in particular, the objection that it won't work. There's obviously a large case study literature as well as a quantitative literature now on the successes of nonviolence. But I would argue we can go further in following Dwayne Cady, and he says, when faced with the objection it won't work, the pacifist response must be simply that nonviolent action does work, and it has a history to document the claim. But then we can go further this and admit that, and I quote again, we simply do not know whether there is a viable practical alternative to violence, and we will not and cannot know unless we are willing to make an effort comparable to the multi-billion-dollar a year effort currently made to produce means of destruction and train young people in their use. This is Robert Holmes. He goes on to make the point even more starkly, and I quote, no one can foresee what the results might be if a country like the United States were to spend $300 billion a year in research on techniques of nonviolent resistance and on educating and training people in their use. In other words, until we can conduct an experiment where we put the same effort and resources into nonviolence that we do into violence, we can't really say for sure whether nonviolence would work. I can kind of predict, though. There are a great many of these other arguments can be dealt with, but so that's the first way of kind of deconstruction, is to respond to those anti-pacifist narratives. But I think the more powerful one is to critique violence and just war theory and the use of force in international politics more directly. So, for example, we can point out that the pacifist argument that violence rarely works is supported by a great deal of empirical literatures, including studies which show that states with greater material capabilities are no more likely to win wars than those with weaker capabilities, and are winning wars less often. The effectiveness of torture is in doubt. Drone killings don't work. There's empirical studies which show that terrorism doesn't work, nor does suppression of terrorism doesn't really work. Violent state repression of popular protest is ineffective. And there are studies which look at the failure of employing violence as a means of protecting civilians by armed groups. And then if we go even deeper, we can make important arguments about the way in which the failure of violence is often based on a misunderstanding about the relationship between violence, force, and power. There's a reason why violence doesn't work, and that's because the effectiveness of violence to deter or compel people depends entirely on how people respond to the violence, not the violence itself. That is, the capacity to destroy bears no direct relation to the ability to coerce, and the application of violence can provoke either deterrence or retaliation, intimidation or rage, submission or resistance, and the desired response can never be assured. Dustin Howes again says, Arendt's theory of action demonstrates that violence is not as reliable as is often assumed. Killing people does not have predictable political results because it operates in the somewhat intangible web of human relations, which makes it difficult to know what meanings people will assign to it or what actions they will take in response to it. There's a lot more arguments I've got here against violence and the way from a philosophical and empirical perspective. One is that most of international relations and most common sense conceives of violence as a kind of a tool that you can pick up and use. But we know from social theory that you can't ever do that. There's no such thing as a tool. All action is constitutive. The means are embedded in the ends. And the means and the ends cannot be separated. So that, for example, being able to use political violence, at the very least, involves having a war system, which involves having a military-industrial complex where you put vast resources into training, science of weapons, and so on. And that, in that sense, you constitute a kind of society. So you can never use violence as a tool. And that's why violence has never been that effective at producing anything more than destruction, pain, screams, and so on. So because we've got so little time, I can't go into all these arguments, but there's a great many arguments that critique violence and just war theory. So that's the second deconstructive response we can do. But the third one is promoting an alternative ethics and set of practices. And this involves pointing out the ethical superiority of nonviolence, which treats people as ends in themselves rather than means to an ends, and is based on values of equality, dignity, and so on. And I'll just end by saying that I think that, as has been mentioned in other sessions, including one this morning that I was at, the current moment is an ideal one for changing the current discourse, particularly in IR. The failure of violence, in particular the failure of 15 years of the war on terror, which has only created a vast amount of new violence and new cycles of violence and increased cycles of violence. I think that there is a broader sympathy out there for the idea that there might be alternatives to using violence. So this is a good moment for us to take the argument into international politics, into the political realm, and put the onus of proof on the people that want to use violence. What evidence do they have that it actually works? What will the results be, and what are the ethics that they're basing it on? And I think if enough of us can resist the kind of shaming mechanisms which say you should be ashamed to be a pacifist, we can make the argument very, very powerfully. I'll finish there.
Thank you.